need renewing all the time, and the new moon is a time of renewal for us. We're reminded of that continual renewal by the cycles that we need by the cycles of the moon. So tonight I want to talk about, where are you invested? So we're talking in the Torah about money, and certainly it takes money to operate buildings, temples, and synagogues and so forth. But I'm also thinking about time, energy, and where you're committed as well. And the question that I have to ask you is also, what about the future? So now the temple is down, and you can't really take the tax to the temple or send the tax to the temple, but what can we do about that, and what does the future portend? And is there a future of your investment? Or is there only destruction? So those questions for you to think about. So the king of Judah, he gets to be king. At the age of 7, in the 7th year of King Yehu's reign, King Yehu struck down his father, and he hid out in the temple for those 7 years. He's a good king, but he fails to demolish the shrines. And so here we have sort of the ambivalence of kings. The ambivalence of kings is that kings come and go. Some are good and some are bad. But because of the sins of the people, God makes a proclamation in which they will suffer for their sins. And so even the good kings cannot save the people. Even though they manage to bring about great things and great restorations, restore the temple and its service, etc., and so forth, the damage has already been done, and God has already decreed that they will pay for their sins. So we have this collection. And there's a problem with this collection in the sense that it's not going to what it's supposed to be going to. So we read about how Joash confronts the high priest about this, and then designates the separate collection for the repair of the temple. Notice that the priests don't have any objection. So what you're seeing is a balance of power between the priest and the king. The king stands as an ensign for his people and has a lot of power, and is seen by God as being the representative. So the king and the high priest are actually the representatives of the people, one in a religious sense, one in a national sense, political sense. And as goes the king, so goes the people. So when they're wicked kings, the people are especially wicked. In this case, they have a good king, but the people continue to be idolatrous in their ways. So he sets up a new system of collection, and the money goes to the place that it's supposed to be going to repair the temple. So according to Rashi, Joash was hidden for the first 6 years of his life after the assassination of his father. Father's name was Ahaziah. He was killed by King Jehu of Israel. And the tradition is that he's held out in the temple, specifically in the Holy of Holies. Not only the high priest was supposed to go in the Holy of Holies, actually, Rashi says that Jehoash acted properly until the priest Jehoiada died. And the people came to him and said, well, you were in the Holy of Holies, you must be a god. And they had and Jehoash was tempted to believe the people. So Malbim says that, it's a modern commentator, said that Jehoiada the priest made an error in the education of Jehoash, and that he taught him on issues that arose every day, but did not teach him Torah adequately, so that Jehoash would be able to think for himself and decide what is right behavior, etc. So what are the goals of education? Are they to teach how to operate on a day-to-day basis? Are they to teach facts and figures? Are they to teach how to think? Are they to teach how to get along in the world? Are they to teach you to learn how to learn? What are the goals of education?
Yeah.
Jewish ethics.
Can you think of any other goals of education?
Transmission of tradition.
Transmission of tradition. And perhaps Joash was too reliant on Jehoiada for that. Of course, coming into being a king at a very young age, he would naturally be that way, and perhaps Jehoiada never expected him to be fully a man or something, and maybe never trained him to be fully in the tradition without relying on the priest. You notice that these names are all similar here. We have Yehu, we have Jehoash, and Jehoiada. Yehu's the king of Israel, the northern kingdom. That his name means God is He. Who is He? And Jehoiada means God knows. Jehoash, God is strong. So why do you think that Jehoash decided to take the job of collection away from the priests?
Money wasn't being spent on where it was supposed to go.
Okay, the money's not getting where it's supposed to go.
And it's somewhat of a conflict of interest.
Yes, and maybe that's why the priests didn't, some commentators say that's why they didn't complain when it was taken away from them. Radak says that they didn't commission any temple repair because they were waiting until they had sufficient funds to get the temple repaired. But of course 23 years of funds is a lot of funds. So perhaps the king suspected that the priests were pocketing the money instead of dedicating it for the repairs of the temple. And we know that the priesthood in Israel did make a lot of money by a lot of different means. The movie The Son of God is out now, and one of the things that was in the time of Yeshua that was a money-making thing was all the purification pools, all the immersion pools around the temple. They would charge you for that too. So in order for you to get clean, ritually clean, so you could go in the temple even, you had to spend money. Some have suggested that Yeshua even taught that there was a purification apart from that. And that would have, if that is the case, and we would have to do some textual study to try to determine that. if that was the case, then you see Yeshua would already be robbing the priests of their income and then throwing the tables over. The money changers and all of that was another way of really upsetting the priests. Directly tagging into their money-making machine there in the temple. So this time that we have now in Shabbat Shekalim is done before or on the first of Adar, and it's announced that the annual temple dues were due on the first of Nisan. So why would this be important? What is going to happen in the temple in Nisan? Pesach, Passover. So you're going to have all these pilgrims traipsing through the temple. Well, if you haven't repaired the temple, it's going to be in worse shape after they come through than if you make your repairs on the temple before they get there. And so it's announced that at this particular time, a month before the month in when Pesach occurs. Now we can read in the Mishnah, which I haven't done, but we can read in the Mishnah to find out what other repairs were done to prepare for Passover. So we might go look in our Pesach volumes and see what repair, if that mentions repairs in the Talmud, because the Talmud, I would assume, contains those Mishnah portions. Talmud does not contain all of the Mishnah. So Torah requires every male from the age of 20 to contribute to the half shekel. So why do you think that it is the age of 20?
Does that have anything to do with the age of accountability?
Well, then if they get a bar mitzvah, that's at a different age, right? Why 20?
Those are the men who could go to battle.
Or war?
No, the men who have found a career by age 20, so they have a source of
They're
income.
starting to make it stand on their own 2 feet. I think initially young men probably were too attached to their parents, their father's house, and so forth, but they weren't really successful until they were a little bit older. That's probably the reason. Anyway, so since the temple is no more, what do we do about this now?
Give it to the synagogue.
Okay, that's an option. And some people say that individuals are obligated to pay dues to the synagogue on the basis of this tax, right? So dues operate in the synagogue very much like a tax in the sense that you indicate what your income is, and they tell you how much, or they give you a chart, and you can figure out you make X number of dollars, you're going to pay Y dues, you know.
Sliding scale.
Right.
But according to this, it was the same for everyone.
It was the same for everybody. Which is sort of a way of saying that every man is valued equally before the Lord, right? It's the same thing as every man can have a blue thread in the corner of his garments and be a king in his own house, on his own Shabbat table, etc., and so forth. And royalty of every man, no matter how poor, is considered. So the question now is, are you contributing to the perpetuation of Judaism? I mean, what does that mean for you? So one piece of that was done by some Zionists in Israel, they said you need to pay this tax to Israel to help support the Jewish people in Israel. And that's perhaps not a bad thing to do. So it's sort of in limbo at the moment because, you know, especially here in our synagogue, because we don't have dues, so we basically don't have a regular collection. We just say that people can put their offerings and their tithes in the pushkin in the back, and just leave it up to people.
Pretty good offering.
So I mentioned earlier that I want to talk about investing in something, and the question is, how that I just raised is, how are you investing in Judaism? Well, you might be investing something other than money. You might be investing your time. You might be investing your efforts and your energy, food, various other things, all sorts of things. And where is it going? That's just, destiny is a very serious question. And I use the idea of destiny as a divider between things. So, just as we separate Shabbat from the rest of the week, we separate holy objects from ordinary objects. I mean, these candles become holy because they're on the Shabbat, but they're just candles before that. So there's separations of things, and oftentimes a lot of things look good, but their destiny is somewhere else different from other things. So I'm going to talk about the Messianic movement a little bit here and where it is going. And I'm going to draw some lines dividing destinies, okay? Some destinies, I think, are in the wrong place. So if you're building the temple, that temple, whatever it is, that house of God, then I think it's going to crumble and will not be the right, will be swallowed up, essentially. And then the other aspect of Messianic Judaism realized that they were in danger of being swallowed up. And I'm going to tell you what that danger is. A sociological anthropologist looked at the Messianic movement in our time, in our day, and said that if the Messianic movement was too closely tied to the church, it would be swallowed up by the church and disappear. And this began to change a long series of changes in the minds of the rabbis that we're associated with, that they needed to do something again to begin a separation. And that separation would then, the challenge, the question that came up, that was the serious question that was posed, was not whether these rabbis would be considered Messianic Jews, but whether their children would be considered Messianic Jews, and their grandchildren think of themselves as Messianic Jews. So unfortunately, there's a 4-generational cycle, and this is the way the 4-generational cycle works with faith. It can work with tradition or various other things. The first generation, it's very authentic, and people are or you could say, are on fire for what their faith and practice and all of that stuff is. The second generation comes along, and they've been born into this, but they're not as quite as genuine. They kind of lost a little bit of this fervor. They just do it because their parents do it, And they would consider themselves whatever their parents are. And then they have children, so now it's into the third generation. And the third generation begins to suspect about their parents that this is not quite authentic. There's something missing here. They're just giving lip service to this, but the fire and the intensity and the genuineness is not quite there. So they begin to question and doubt and so forth. And they have children in the fourth generation comes along, and they say, butt kiss, we don't want anything to do with this, because they look at their parents who were questioning the whole thing, and they say, we don't want to have anything to do with this. So it's been suggested that there's a 4-generational cycle. I think the whole country, the United States, looks like it's in that 4th generation. And what needs to happen now, if you were to use Christian terms, is a revival, something to start over again, and first generation would be coming out of that. And I think there's a lot of things to suggest there's a great change coming in our society and religion as well. So in Messianic Judaism has considered this, and they've considered where is their destiny, where are they going, well, how can they keep from being swallowed up, how can they be identified in the world, and so they begin to challenge many things. And so for 25 years, the Messianic Jewish movement was essentially birthed out of the church, out of the evangelical Protestant church, and then they was seen to be associated with the church. And Jews still accuse Messianic Judaism of being in the church. But then when this turn started, people began to realize that there was something more that they needed, and they gradually started a turn, which the movement called Hashivenu sprung up. And Hashivenu means let us return, and it was the idea that let us return to Judaism, let us be authentically Jewish and return to that. So the two movements that are out there really, one is an evangelical type movement, we call it a missiological approach, and the other one is a new approach which has been proclaimed by Mark Kinzer and others. And so in digesting all of this is where the question of where are you investing comes up, because they both look appropriately biblical on the outside. From if you were to judge them, maybe one, it depends on which perspective you're viewing them from. So the evangelicals look at the Hashivenu group, and they say, well, they spend too much time with Talmud and these other things. And one group looks at the other one and says they're too much like the church, they're offending Jews, and they're not really very effective in their evangelism. So there's this kind of cross thing. So when we try to digest these types of things, here's what we find out. Is that if you were to look at the missionary posture towards Jews that the church has had, and this evangelical missiological approach in Messianic Judaism has had, we have to save Jews, keep them from going to hell. That has no precedence in the New Testament. However, an apostolic approach where Jews are addressing other Jews does have a precedence in the apostolic writings. So it is not the church teaching Jews they have to come to Jesus. It is Messianic Jews talking to Jews that can make that realizable. Now, the Jewish affiliation is very much an issue here, because Jews will really only recognize something that they sense as authentically Jewish. And if they're continually calling Messianic Judaism Christianity. So here are 5 basic principles that have been boiled out of this kind of movement of Hashivenu. One is the perpetual validity of God's covenant with the Jewish people. Second, the perpetual validity of the Jewish way of life rooted in the Torah. So that Jewish practice, has been, if a person wanted to believe that Yeshua was the Messiah, they were immediately told not to have anything to do with the Jewish way of life and Jewish practice. So, one of the reasons why Jews react the way they do. The validity of Jewish religious tradition as the historical embodiment of the Jewish way of life rooted in Torah. So, tradition, it has a place. Actually, tradition has really kept Jews as Jews in the world, and that's the reason that Jews have survived, is largely through tradition. And fourth, the bilateral constitution of the ecclesia, consisting of distinct but united Jewish and Gentile expressions. So the church is okay. It's got its own liturgy, and it can exist over there, but it's also equally valid for the Jewish people to have their own liturgy, their own ways of things. And this comprises now the bilateral ecclesiology, just mean the big words to mean that the people of God are these two groups. They're like brothers, right? And one is the Jewish side, and the other one is the side from the nations. And that they need each other, actually. There's there's an ecumenical imperative of the ecclesia, which entails the bringing of the redeemed nations of the world into solidarity with the people of Israel in anticipation of Israel's and the world's final redemption. So if that means that if you take Israel and the Jewish people out of the equation, you have just violated God's plans. And there are also some people floating around out there who they have I'll give you an example. They have a recognition of the Jewish people and of Israel, but as soon as a Messianic Jew steps onto the page, they cannot receive that person. Will not receive that person. So, I guess I'm going to have to name names. Well, maybe I won't name names. I'll just say that there's a famous pastor over in San Antonio who makes a big noise about Israel. One of our rabbis wrote him a letter and said, "Hi, I'm a Messianic Jew. I'm Tony Eaton over here in Massachusetts, and I'd like to come talk to you." And he got a letter back from one of the underlings of this guy, and he said, basically, the underling just said, "Go away. We don't want to talk to you." See, that's a test. Where's the destiny? The destiny of what he's doing is that exactly what the interfaith movement does, and that is that there is a parallel track for one for Jews, one for people of the nations, and they will respect each other, but there will not be anything that contradicts those. So as soon as Messianic Jews come onto the picture, everybody's mad at them because Jews are mad at them, Christians are mad at them, and so actually our president at the time was Jamie Cowan was president. He was with a major fundraiser in Judaism who goes under a banner and collects a lot of money from Christians. And as soon as Jamie came into the room, this guy stood up to walk out. And Jamie said, "If you walk out, I'm going to tell all of my Christian friends you left this meeting." He sat back down because he realized what damage it would do to his fundraising. And all the Christians, they say the right language, but they're doing great things. They help Jews, they bring Jews to the land and do all this stuff, but they falsely advertise using Christian terminology. And if they ever call you on the phone, you'll think you just ran into one of the holy brothers of the Yeshua movement, but they're really not. They're not that. So these principles have been laid out for in a definition of Messianic Judaism. This is our definition of Messianic Judaism that came from the Union. Messianic Judaism is a movement of Jewish congregations and congregation-like groupings committed to Yeshua the Messiah that embrace the covenantal responsibility of Jewish life and identity rooted in Torah, expressed in tradition, and renewed and applied in the context of the new covenant. So this is corporate terms. There's a community life, not this thing of a bunch of individuals running around wild Indians unto themselves. But, there is a whole group of them. Brian likes to go out and talk with those people, or at least he did. All those people that like to run off in their own little direction. So it's a community life. So the honor of Torah and Jewish tradition is very important. And Israel is given primacy. So what this is doing is that this is not portraying the Jewish community. I mean, we're talking about going down to Lamud. We'll be in Jewish community there. And you can learn a tremendous amount of stuff in Lamud. But we're not viewing it as an external mission field from this definition. In other words, somebody from the evangelical missiological approach would say, oh, they're all damned and going to hell. I got to go down there and share the gospel with them. Well, we don't view it that way because the Jewish community is home. It's not this external thing that's damned and going to hell, but it is home. Why? Because God's covenant, God's people, all of those things are there. And God has a plan. Jews, I've actually sat in groups of Jews. I think it was at Shir Hadash, the conservative synagogue, and somebody said something. I can't remember the event. Somebody said something from the front that God was going to save Jews. And I looked around the room and everybody was nodding their head. They believe that God is going to save them. Is that faith? I think so. Just don't know who the Messiah is yet. So Paul says God has blinded their eyes. So, who are we to question why? Paul kind of gives us a reason, or to say we're better than them, because if God had blinded our eyes, there but for the grace of God would be us. So here's another important principle. And I'm building this house here. That's what I'm doing. Building this house and telling you what the pillars and structures are of this house that y'all are investing in here, either with your time or your food or your money or whatever it is. I'm not getting any money from this place, so I don't, it's not really that, it's not personally that important to me. I just want to see the place survive if it can. So this means that we're continuing on in Jewish tradition, and this also means, and this is very important for us, is that Halakha is not fixed once and for all time, but it must be dynamic and faithful. It involves the application of Torah to a wide variety of changing situations and circumstances, which is why our rabbis, that's what we call them, our rabbis, the Messianic Jewish Rabbinic Council, says you can operate a microwave on Shabbat. They are adjusting to the situations and circumstances. So they have made their ruling. So now the question is that this is the way that Jews would approach that. They would say, well, that's what our rabbis say. I want to be a little stricter. Maybe I'm not going to turn on the microwave. Or they're not going to look down their nose at somebody who turns on the microwave. So, there are other things. You can go read the halakhic statement. It will not agree with everything in traditional orthodoxy or conservative or reform, but it is the deliberation of our rabbis. So the halakha is adapted. Our halakha also has to reflect Messiah Yeshua and what he taught. So sometimes there's a collision, maybe a collision between Orthodox Judaism and Messiah Yeshua actually looked like a very liberal Pharisee on many issues. Now, there were some issues that he was extremely strict on.
Divorce.
That was one of them. So, that was, so most of the time he's of the school of Hillel, which is very lenient, very considerate of people, not the school of Shammai. As a matter of fact, he made statements like your house is going to fall, etc., and so forth. And looking back now, we know the house of Shammai has not survived. All of Judaism today is Hillelite Judaism. Even the Orthodox are Hillelite Judaism, even though they might be stricter than maybe what the Hillelites were like in the time of Yeshua. But nonetheless, every piece of Judaism today is surviving from the Hillelite Judaism. So Messianic Judaism embraces the fullness of the covenant, new covenant through Yeshua, and seeks to express this in forms drawn from Jewish experience, and it's accessible to Jewish people. That's important. I'll tell you a personal story that I was in the synagogue, and I was banging a tambourine, and there was a Jewish person who came in and was visiting, friends of some other people, and they sat there and stared at me the whole service long. They could not figure out why I was banging a tambourine. Now, the evangelical group would think there was nothing wrong with banging a tambourine, but I was causing a stumbling block to the person and the people who were visiting that were Jewish, and I shouldn't have been doing it because that's not done in the synagogue. Just an example of how we can make Messianic Judaism accessible to Jewish people. And they'll say that this synagogue, had some Jewish people come in. They're of blessed memory today, but they came in. One was already a Messianic Jew. The other one became a Messianic Jew through the mission of the ministry of this synagogue. And, they found a home here. That's the hope and the dream, really, I think, for Messianic Judaism, is that Jews will find a home in Messianic Judaism and then be able to receive Messiah as their Messiah. Not that they're converting to another religion or anything. That's a very, very important aspect. They're just receiving Messiah. The teleos of the Torah, the end of the Torah. Messianic Judaism, as a branch of Judaism, emphasizes the importance of practical integration with the wider Jewish world. That's why we're not afraid to go participate in Jewish events. We don't see ourselves as fundamentally different from these other groups. And matter of fact, it actually allows us to sort of relax and be friendly with all of these people. And that's actually a real acid test of how you are positioning yourself within the wider Jewish world. Are you integrating well in the wider Jewish world? Do you have friends that are Jews in the wider Jewish world, etc., and so forth? If the answer is yes, then you consider it as home and not just as a religious or theological mission field, etc. So here's where the evangelicals really get mad at us. They bear, because we take the evangelical concerns and various other things, and we say that the ecclesial, the relationships that we have are more important than the evangelical. So that really upsets the ones who are evangelically oriented, because they say you're not doing what you should be doing, because all you should do is spend all your time trying to convince people that Yeshua is the Messiah, and you have to broadcast that out at every opportunity. And if you don't, then there's something wrong with you. That's what kind of the impression that I get from the evangelical world. By the way, this type of Judaism that I'm talking about here does not want to abandon the idea of helping Jews receive Messiah, but they want to find more effective ways of having Jews receive Messiah. So if there's a wall built up in front of you, why do you sit there and bash your head against the wall trying to do that? Sometimes the non-direct approach, which is, the hitting your head against the wall, most evangelical efforts have been a total failure with Jews. I got a whole book on it at home, so if you want to read it, I can loan it to you, but it's been a total failure. And so there's the idea of going up and trying to bash the front door down, but then there's another way. You could sneak around the back way and kind of consider yourself part of the family and be sneaking in the back door and you have an influence. So just as a little leaven leavens the whole lump in a negative way, it also can do something in a positive way. So I've made several proclamations at times which have gotten me into some trouble. One time I made a proclamation at the road to Jerusalem with Coach, what's his name? Bill McCartney. We were invited up to Baton Rouge, sitting at the table having dinner, and I said, well, I don't think that there's Messianic Judaism is really going to be accepted in Israel until there's a rabbinic Messianic Judaism. And you could have heard the pin drop on the floor after I said that. I said that in reaction to one of the people there at the table who was a Christian, who I thought was treating Jews like little notches in his belt, like a gunslinger. Oh, I got one, I got one, I got one. And he was totally insensitive to Judaism, and I was very offended by that, and that's the reason I made that statement. So the question now, I guess, is for us we always have to apply the biblical test. And if we look into Ephesians, we see that it speaks of the relationship between Jews and Gentiles in Messiah as the archetype of the reconciliation that Yeshua brings to the world. And so I'm going to say this about that whole thing. And I think what's going to happen, or what should happen, is that when the church changes some of its attitude, throws out its replacement theology, that this kind of reconciliation is going to be much easier to happen. And the key is that as the church changes, Jews will react to that. And so the first thing that must happen is not with the Jews, but with the church. So Messianic Judaism has a ministry to try to breathe the right kind of theology into that world. By the way, the first theology was breathed for Messianic Jews into the nations of the world. Paul was a Pharisee and a Jew until he died. He claimed in all his trials that he was a Jew. And all this stuff about the new Paul is basically just the church finally recognized, oh yeah, he was really Jewish. So they finally, it took them 2,000 years to probably not 2,000 years. Probably about year 300 when the separation between the church and the synagogue is really, Steve and I were talking about that the church really wanted to throw out its connection with Judaism at one point about the year 300 or so. And there was an equal and opposite reaction in Judaism. I'm not going to explain that tonight because it would take you a while to grasp it. But basically, I'll give it to you in a nutshell. Basically, Judaism had a consideration of God's word was like a living being that operated outside of him. This is early in the 1st and 2nd century and so forth. And basically, after the Christians came around and said, "Oh, we know who that is. That's Jesus," then the Jews said, we can't have that theology anymore. No, throw it out. So they threw it out, and an exclusively monotheistic idea entered Judaism. That there was no such thing as any kind of duplicity or multiple things within the Godhead. But if you go back and look at the old literature, it's there. And so I think that what's happening is that the world is moving. What God is doing in the world is God is moving toward this reconciliation. Messianic Judaism is at the forefront. I'm telling you, there are some men that I know, Judy knows them too, Ryan knows them, who I think are like the spearhead of this. When we ask people to read Mark Kinzer's books, there's a reason, because he is at the spearhead. Actually, in interfaith conferences, there was one in Jerusalem. They had Catholics, they had Orthodox Jews there. And somebody piped up and said, Mark Kinzer should be here. They finally recognized the Messianic Jew who would be able to help them. And there was a standing ovation for Mark Kinzer. He wasn't there. But there is movements of things going on in the world, and things are changing. I think it's going to take 300 years. I don't know where I came up with that number. It's just a nice round number. It's going to take a long time because you don't see change happening very quickly. On the other hand, I have also seen God work in strange ways and do strange things. So I may have to revise that if God does some different things. So the question that I have for you, where is your investment? So is your investment in what God is doing, what I've described, or is your investment someplace else? Some people come into Messianic Judaism and they kind of, what I call two-footer. They're sort of still in the church, and it takes a while. It really does take a while for a transition to take place. Or are you trying to recognize what God is really wanting to do, how God is really trying to reconstruct his house, which is going to be a house like Solomon dedicated, a house of prayer for all nations, which includes the Jewish people, does not exclude the Jewish people, but it also includes the nations. So I think what we see in Shabbat Shekalim is that it takes money. I go to meetings all the time where they're discussing the budget, and there just ain't enough to go around at the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. And you go and look at how these various things are funded, and they're not funded very well at all. So these men make a tremendous sacrifice in their lives. When I sit there and look at somebody like Mark Kinzer, who devotes his entire life, takes a small income from his synagogue and devotes his entire life, supported by his wife, I think largely. He travels around the world, goes to various conferences and teaches and does all of this stuff. And it's tremendous dedication. And he's not the only one. I mean, there's other people like Stuart Dowerman, Rich Nickel. Some of these men are just what I consider to be the fathers of the modern Messianic movement. And so what I have been privileged to do is to be with these men and realize what is going on, what God is doing through this whole movement. And it's here as well. Will it survive here? I don't know. Will it survive nationally? That's a big question. The UMJC is heavily investing in its youth because they're afraid that it's not going to transfer well to the youth. They want to have more Messianic rabbis. They have a steep goal. I don't know if you can remember how many they're talking about now, but I can tell you because last time I took a course, there were not enough people in the course for them to meet their goal. But they are pushing, and they're trying to get more and more and more people to go into it. But it is a sacrifice on their part for them to do that. Real sacrifice. Some of these people are so talented that they could go out and make a lot of money in the private sector, but it takes a commitment. It takes not a willingness to give an offering of your time, your money, your life, your energy. That's what I think Shabbat Chekalim refers to, is that you're willing to give a small amount to the temple, right? But really what God wants is He wants people that are wholly dedicated to Him and are willing to pay the price. And the question is, how much are you investing? It may not be money, it may be time, maybe other things. The question is, how much are you investing? Any comments? Questions?
Yeah, I got,
Reactions?
it goes back to what God said to the Israelites in the book of Haggai. Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts. This people say, time has not come, the time of the Lord's house should be built. Then came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet, saying, is it time for you, O you who dwelled in sealed houses, and this house, referring to the temple that was being rebuilt, lies waste? Now therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, Adonai Tsebaoth, consider your ways. You have sown much and bring in little. You eat, but you have not enough. You drink, but you are not filled with drink. You clothe you, but there is none warm. And he who earns wages puts it in bags with holes. Thus, exactly. Thus says the Lord. The Lord commands us to consider our ways, and the Lord commands us to take a look at how we budget our money, where we're spending it, whether it be in the world, whether it be in the synagogue, or whether it be on a nice big juicy piece of steak, when God needs for us to invest in His kingdom.
It's a very, very good verse. I met Pistol Pete Maravich, and he had a lot of money, and I'll tell you his testimony very shortly. He was driving across the causeway in his Porsche, thinking about killing himself, and he had an experience, cried out to God on the causeway, and had an experience where God met him, changed his whole life, and he became a follower of Yeshua, and changed what he was doing. So he was like that person who's filling the bag full of holes. He had a lot of money, he had a lot of stuff, but his life was meaningless, and he wanted to kill himself. And so he was an interesting person who changed his ways from the ways that Haggai is talking about there.
Floppy socks.
Amen.